Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I think this is really important to share with the media at large. I appreciate the chance to share some of the things we have observed in coverage of the case since the ruling and kind of give some guidance or thoughts about best practices for covering it. To start, I have some short prepared comments. Then I'll open it up for feedback and questions and let Angel jump in on some of that. Then she'll share her perspective from the front line, leading Muscogee media currently. And from there, we may have a joint discussion with the group. So to start, many in the Indigenous community have advocated for not calling the case simply McGirt. Sorry, I'm still admitting people here. In an effort to make sure the sovereignty and jurisdiction component of it is not overlooked. It is so important, in fact, that the primary focus of the case, the question, opinion, etc., focus mainly on the tribe's jurisdiction. And here's the opinion we held for MCA, Major Crimes Act. Purposes, land reserved for the Cree Nation since the 19th century remains Indian country. And the following lead opinion text is built around this. And we eventually arrive at Gorsuch's quote that spurred the name of this project, Promised Land. I acknowledge getting away from using McGirt terminology in print may be a challenge in headline writing, and that referring to the case or cases as the X decision is pretty standard. But at least hear me out on some thoughts around the spirit of this notion. My main point today is that historical context needs to be a priority in coverage, and really is a fairness balance to coverage of the offenders. So that means what this case means to the tribe, admitting people, its land and sovereignty, according to the ruling, how we really got here due to treaty relations with the government and federal law, and the assumption that allotment caused disestablishment without a direct act of Congress to do so. So mostly or just covering individual criminal stories is not just unethical, it's inaccurate and incomplete. There's been a big focus in mainstream coverage on defendants, perps getting off charges, retrials, etc., but not so much focus on the sovereignty and land component of the SCOTUS proceedings, question, and opinion centered around. Yes, these criminal cases under review do need to be followed to ensure what's happened with dangerous or potentially dangerous people. And of course, we're also seeing quickly potential civil implications coming down as well. But understand that in essence, this case was the most effective option the tribes were presented with to recapture sovereignty with many different attempts in the past. However, it was presented and driven for a long time in the circuit, as I understand it, by the petitioners and their counsel. From what I've gathered, and you would think, if the tribe had another option at recapturing sovereignty, they would have been happy to have it over cases attached to these criminals. But the tribe was not going to walk away from the opportunity, circling back to the note on past attempts. And again, the focus of the SCOTUS case as it was presented in the scope of tribal jurisdiction for all parties. I understand that often in coverage, something that happened way in the past will often be placed towards the bottom of copy for background context. But again, given the name of this project is Promised Land, based on Gorsuch's lead opinion regarding the land promised to our tribe, I argue that with this story, history is very much current and needs to be presented as such. I say that if an outlet hasn't done an analysis piece directly on the case, its briefs, and the history cited within, they should probably do so to inform their other coverage. Foundational knowledge of the case should be essential to anyone doing pieces. Having done a broad context story, you can draw from excerpts to place in following pieces to have a condensed version of the context, or a link to the piece in subsequent stories and place that in the copy. I also advocate for seeking qualified Indigenous sources and probably start with Indigenous attorneys. NAJA has a resource for sources, and I sent Rob this and several others to share that regard other general guidelines for covering Indigenous issues, as well as others for this case, including some from OKSBJ. Finally, outlets should consider hiring Indigenous, especially for leadership positions. And I say this knowing fully I'm advocating for the talent market to become more difficult for my tribal media colleagues like Angel.
I'm losing recruits every day when you guys do this.
Yeah, NAJA's working on building the pipeline for more talent. So we're doing what we can. But yeah, doing these things can really foster on-the-job training for those not familiar with tribal issues. And having an empowered Indigenous voice in the newsroom can help with many specific judgment calls, issues that broadly focused trainings and resources may not be able to address. I've noticed many times in pieces you won't see any mention of at least an attempt to contact the tribe or tribes, when it's obvious an assertion was made by someone on the other side of the issue that warranted an attempt to do so for balance. I am a Creek citizen, but also a journalist, so I'm talking strictly in terms of ethics, advocating only for deep consideration of valid and, again, banner headline tribal interests that are a main part of this issue. When I worked at Muscogee Media, we pushed our officials hard on how they were preparing ahead of the ruling and their case involvement, to the point I think we made some uncomfortable. Some of you may be aware of my history there with the free press effort. Given that, I hope you believe that I have no intention of doing PR for Muscogee Nation or any other tribe. What I'm saying is, it's simply logical fact based on the case documents that the historical context must remain part of the discussion as we move forward from the decision, as it is front and center based on the empirical legal documentation we have on the issue. When I was involved in coverage, we were about the basics of good journalism, pursuing all the clear lead details of the story and the perspectives of all interested parties. A fair amount of our tribal citizens have concerns about the remaining questions left by the ruling, just like everybody else. You may have seen the piece from the Tulsa World, joined us today, where our former chief, A.D. Ellis, shared his personal experience with navigating law enforcement after the ruling. Many on all sides recognize this is a delicate situation, and the media play a very big part in how constructive the public conversation on this is going to be moving forward. Let's be real, things are hot. Honestly, we're in a state where you can carry without a permit, and a social climate where the public conversation on diversity is prevalent and tough. Not to be too inflammatory, but I want to underscore the major importance of responsible reporting on this case. And that's my final thought. And I'll take any questions, comments, or open it up to Angel.
I'll just wait for the questions first.
Okay.
But I have comments. I always have comments, sorry.
I'll start. One of the things that we keep running into is that we are dealing with some cases that are pretty sensitive. What is your advice or guidance when it comes to institutions like the Tulsa World and the rest of us trying to approach those victims' families? Sometimes we're trying to go through the tribe. Sometimes we're trying to go through other methods to connect with them. We do want to bring the victim back into this and not just make this about another trial for another, convicted felon. What is some of your advice for us to do that tactfully and again, respect what has already been done?
I think this is definitely an Angel question. She's been doing coverage currently.
The first thing I really like to see done when we're doing coverage on these cases, because there are a lot of them and we all know that they have a heavy impact, and we are all in this position where we are, our hearts are going out to these victims who are basically being re-traumatized. But the first question I always want to ask is, who's responsible for the re-traumatization of these people? where did this issue originate from? And a lot of times it seems like people say or believe it originated with the tribes because this SCOTUS opinion is about tribal jurisdiction. But in reality, it did not originate with a tribal government. It originated with the state of Oklahoma broadly overreaching their jurisdiction. And I think that we should be asking our officials about that and what they're doing to provide resources to these victims, because there are a lot of things being done. The Muscogee Nation, for example, has dumped a tremendous amount of money into victim advocacy services, and they're collaborating very closely with U.S. attorneys and helping these people, you know, navigate this process that they're having to go through again. And so I think that's the most responsible place to start, and then tell the story of these folks, because these folks do have a story, and they do have basically an unfair shake because of where this problem, you know, came into play. And we don't even know how far back this can go, right? Because imagine like what are the parameters of this? You know, the state of Oklahoma was formed in 1906. Was every single case tried from the time of its inception to now considered something that's appealable? How many of these people are alive and well and able to appeal? And that's a big thing. And I think that's the responsible place to start when we're talking about the victims and their stories and the re-traumatization. I think that responsibility really does lie on the state of Oklahoma to answer for. And then we ask the tribes the question, are you, as fastidiously as you can, processing justice in Indian country, right? Like, you've been now in the position that you're going to administer justice. What are you doing to do it? That's really where it is, because nothing about the SCOTUS opinion ever touches on the ethics of journalism. That never changes. We report without harm, we report unbiased information, and we report in context. Those things will never change. So really, we do our jobs as we are meant to do under the ethical guidelines of our profession, and we have to consider that historical context in that.
Has the tribe set up any agencies or certain groups to help reach out to the victims that are being connected to these cases? Are they being contacted at all by the tribes?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know about every tribe. I can only really speak to the services that we kind of connect to and that we report on. And then the Muscogee Creek Nation has a family violence prevention department that they have put extensive amounts of money in. And you often see this department at all of these events where you see the Attorney General or the U.S. Attorney, these advocates for justice in Indian country. They have themselves out there too. They're putting a lot of money into things like, you know, victims resources. They're hiring caseworkers like you wouldn't believe. And then I would really kind of, you know, hammer in the fact that without, you know, having maybe created this like adverse situation, the tribes are trying to take some responsibility in that realm. As long as the story can mention that in some way, and even if you reach out to the tribe and they don't comment, which can happen quite a bit, I do it all the time, and I receive, you know, no comment, or they don't respond to me at time of press, we just report on our process and that we did fairly reach out and provide the opportunity. And I think that satisfies all of our ethical guidelines.
Thank you.
No, any other questions, comments?
I had a question. If you can hear me okay. You had mentioned before that analysis contextual piece that you think that should be in these stories dealing with particular cases or really anything related to this ruling. Is that something that you want to see in every single story? Prime at the top, or like ideally? No,
I mean, what I'm saying is if you're just jumping right into the pieces about the offenders and the outlet hasn't done a sweeping story on the case, just the details, the brief, the arguments, whatever, I think you're jumping the gun, because you need that foundational knowledge of the case to really inform your coverage of the impacts after the ruling. And so basically how you could include that in subsequent coverage is you could draw little excerpts from that history piece, you know, to throw that in there briefly, those following stories, or you could just do that thing that folks do where they link it kind of mid-copy, you know, to jump that to the historical context piece, say it comes up in your current story, you know, and they can just click on that and be like, oh, I need more background before I keep reading and understanding this current piece.
Gotcha.
You have that broad overarching context that you've done a lot of research on. It probably took a lot of time. You probably reached out to all those historical experts and even some of these professors who are experts in Indian law, and you've put together this like big, broad overscope of what this case means. And you probably have some tribal officials quoted, and you've probably already addressed the fact that even the tribes are not of the exact same opinion on how to carry this out. And then you just hot link that sucker in everywhere you can and reference it with all your new coverage.
Yeah.
Sterling, Angel, would you mind sharing what stories stand out to you in the last year as examples of the right kind of journalism, the right kind of context, the things that you've been referring to this morning?
One of my absolute favorite is Allison's piece, that one of her really recent ones that she did on the family whose you know, child was killed. I mean, that was what I get the most frustrated about, is when we're writing for our audience, but we haven't considered the fact that we have a lot of natives in our audience, right? Like that's a really big problem. And this is Oklahoma, where there are 39 tribal nations. And so realizing that data-wise, we do only make up X% of the population, we're still relying on mainstream media for a lot of our information and a lot of our big breaking coverage, because the nature of the tribal government is this. Muscogee Creek Nation is operating under a constitution that was adopted in 1979. A lot of the tools that we use to report on the federal government or the state government, things like FOIA and document requests, those are very new to us in the tribal governments, right? We're just learning to implement these things. My press is still fighting for press protection and freedom and the right to deliver information. We do not have a free speech code on the books right now that I'm aware of. So these are things that we have to understand when we're going out there and trying to grab the information, is that we're writing for an audience that is almost as disenfranchised as anyone else is from the information, and they want it. They want it no matter who puts it out there and no matter what your affiliation is as a tribal citizen. They just want to see that stakeholder is represented in your coverage. It's about reporting for the community, not just on the community. So realizing that every day we're going to have instances of Native people who are for or against this thing, and representing their voice as adequately as we would represent the voices of anyone else is really, really important. On May 23rd, I had my own very personal experience with having to use emergency services. I'm a Muscogee Creek citizen who had to call 911 for an ambulance. The question was asked to me by dispatch and then by officers and ambulatory staff. This is not a crime, by the way, that I call it on. It's a medical emergency. They asked me if I'm a Native citizen while my daughter sat in an ambulance. And I want to know why they asked this question. Why can 911 ask me this question? What does it matter? Are you going to take my child out of an ambulance and tell me to haul her to the hospital myself? These are the stories that are compounding on top of Indigenous people right now that nobody is doing and nobody is thinking of, because we're so caught up in the fact that there's a lot of cases appealing from the justice system, and it's very, very bad. Indian criminals are running free. That's the message we're putting out, but we aren't putting out any of the other very subtle nuances that are making it very difficult to be a Native American in Indian country right now. So there's a lot more to it than just that. And I think that that's important to remember, that this audience, who is your audience too, they want answers. I'm a journalist and I want answers. I still haven't found them all. So we work together on this. If we find the right people to ask the questions to, and if we don't allow propaganda or just unchecked facts to get into our coverage, I think we start peeling back the layers of this a little bit more.
Yeah, I really like what I've seen from Non-Doc, The Frontier, Tulsa World. Of course, that Ellis piece was really cool, interesting angle. Everything's very sober and down the line and fair. But you know, what you just heard Angel point out is like how this case, again, like mentioning Ellis, is causing some difficulties and confusion for tribal citizens as much as it is for non-natives. So we're all really in this together and trying to figure it out. And, you know, the difficulties are spread out pretty fairly, as a matter of fact. So you see these cases where, you know, a tribal offender may have committed a violent crime against a non-native, and, you know, there's a lot of coverage about DA is upset, of course, the victim family is upset. Those stories need to be covered, but on the other side, yes, this ruling was in our favor, but it doesn't mean that the road to getting to where we figure out how to incorporate it has been easy or is going to be.
And I would really like, I mean, any kind of article that is encompassing of both sides. You know, there's problems on both sides. There's in some ways there's you know, advantages to this. When we see like the missing and murdered Indigenous people movement, and we understand the nuances that go into how that happened, and we see that now this jurisdiction is coming under federal and tribal jurisdiction, what kind of impacts are we going to see to those issues that are compounding in our communities, in our both native and non-native communities? How does that help? I like stories like that. I also like stories where we just very, you know, basically say, you know, this kind of sucks for everyone a little bit. But here's the reality of it. People have rights and they can appeal, and there's not a lot we can do about that except ask, what are we going to do to fix this in the future to make sure it doesn't happen anymore? Maybe some solutions journalism is time to step in and do some of that. Because I have real big questions for the mechanisms in place that facilitate this, because a person calls 911, they get asked their, you know, basically racial identity, which I don't think is legal, and I'm pretty sure that's civil rights violation. What's the process like from there? Do they put them on hold, call up the tribe, or do they just patch it through? Is the tribe even patched into the 911 system is a good question, because if they're not, my goodness, you're a little bit behind the ball now that this is in order. And are you getting that fixed? Because I have questions for the tribe just as much as I have for the state of Oklahoma. Has anyone asked the question of, how do we know these people are native? Because good luck figuring out if I am when I'm driving in my car, right? Like, you're making a big assumption or a really broad reach. Are you just asking this of everyone? What if I tell you I'm not? Who takes me to jail if I make a big boo-boo? And what happens down the road if I've lied and then I appeal? These are the kinds of things that we have to look into. And what's actually happening, and what no one's doing a story about right now, is how the Muscogee Creek Nation has had to almost triple and quadruple the budget of its citizenship office, which used to be just a couple of people looking up records, right? And they would verify whether you could be a citizen by who you're related to. Now they're having to verify these dispatch calls. That's insane. Like, this is really wild. It's changing the whole you know, spectrum of tribal government too. So those would be kind of interesting stories to just hear about.
Yeah, and I think what I've seen is there's some resentment to the tribes that they feel they've created this difficult situation. And just getting back to some of my initial points, that the court made this ruling based on the law they saw from history, and just decided that, you know, the legal framework that the state had been operating on since before it was founded was false. And it's just not logical or fair to put that on the tribe. You know, they're basically, the court was trying to practice what they saw as good law, regardless of, there was a lot of arguments in the case from the other side of the difficult situation it would create. But that in and of itself is that a justification for not observing the law as it stands. And I think those are the two kind of things there playing off of one another that are kind of playing out in this case and kind of shaping different public perspectives on it.
Thanks.
Well, Angel, you have more comments?
I also want to, like, I just really want to see too, some cover, like I think that we've all kind of like processed the fact, like, unless we dig deep into the mechanisms of the appeals process and how that works, I want to see coverage, and I want to answer the question about, like, we are journalists, and, you know, and we are always taught to follow the money. Like, where is the restitution for this stuff going? You know, fines and fees for courts. How is that impacting the state of Oklahoma? How is that impacting the tribal nations too? What do we do, you know, with those fees? And we know how the state of Oklahoma handles them. You go onto ODCR and you see the breakdown of all those funds, and, well, what are the tribes going to be doing with it? If the restitutions come into the tribe, because I believe it is in some cases, at least. Another thing that I would really like to point out too is we've done coverage where we have interviewed our justice officials, and we've asked them, you know, how are you? We've been doing it actually for years. How are you preparing for this? And then our coverage even got roped into the state of Oklahoma's argument. It was a big, crazy mess. But one of the things that we've been asking is, like, how are we facilitating this, like, in procedure? You know, at one point our courts were closed. COVID was a thing. I couldn't tell you if the tribe was picking up these cases or not. But now there's a docket published, and it's up on the website. So I'm just curious of how many journalists even actually know that you can go onto those websites and you can kind of check back and forth when you have somebody like an angry DA who's obviously angry for a very good reason. You know, criminals are appealing out of the justice system, right? That pisses me off to no end. But what's happening to them? Are they going straight over to the federal jurisdiction? Are they going to, because I've looked at the dockets for the Muscogee Creek Nation, and they're like 7 pages long where they used to be 1. And they're processing cases. And it's easy to find information. I think that a lot of times we get hammered into our deadline is going to be at this time, and whether we follow up all the way with all the details, hell be damned, it's just the tribes, you know, whatever, it'll sort itself out. But that's important to follow up on. That's a really important end of the story, really, because if you leave that story with just so-and-so appealed and now so-and-so's out of jail, you're really doing a disservice to the ethical guidelines to cause no harm. Because I live in a neighborhood, I have a tag on my car that says I'm a citizen of the Muscogee Creek Nation, and all it takes is Bubba Joe Bob Smith to get really freaking pissed that day and confront me on the way to my car and say some horrible things. If I'm lucky, that's what'll happen, right? I mean, to be honest, is that doing our communities any service, you know, and is it doing our organizations a disservice for trustworthiness? Because I don't think it is. People that I looked up to and admired my whole life, I knew I wanted to be just like them when I grew up, or some of them are doing stories now, and I'm like, ugh, I don't know you, you know, like that's a really kind of a tragic place to be in this industry that's already been, you know, villainously painted by, you know, whatever political entities want to talk bad about journalists, but we really have to think about that. And our next generation coming up, you know, do they want to work in this field where they have to fight so hard for the credibility when we could have been laying the groundwork for them and keeping, I know that information is fast. I know we want instant gratification, but sometimes we do have to slow it down.
Hey, Sterling, with the historical context, I wanted to ask a quick question. If the whole case in McGirt did not start with the tribes and the case originated with the state of Oklahoma overreaching, what are the types of stories that could be written with that framing?
Well, you could do a story just on that pretty much. I mean, that's kind of what I'm advocating for, is like, I think there's a sense of urgency of we need to keep up with everything that's happening after the ruling because there's so much. And of course, I don't think anybody has enough resources to really keep up with all of that. But the looking back also provides us a lot of context for these current stories. And so it's just exploring what are those different contexts and how can you build different leads around that and still provide relevant stories about the past that are very pertinent to what's happening now. Angel, you got any specific thoughts on leads for that question?
I mean, one of my favorite leads is probably so boring that I doubt anyone would want to pick it up. But like who's done a story lately to point out the fact that this isn't happening in a microcosm bubble? This is not a place on Earth that is the first place on Earth to ever be a metropolitan reservation.
Yeah.
Right? Like, who's done that story recently?
That's a good one.
I mean, lots of them exist. Plenty of cities are on reservations and they're thriving metropolises all over the country. Like, but who's done that story, right? Like, and the records are easy to find, super easy to find. And I've had friends who kind of come to me, like I have friends in all kinds of industries, and they're like, I'm a real estate agent. This lady just got word that maybe the Oklahoma is a reservation now and she doesn't want to buy this ranch and this house. What should I tell her? I'm like, tell her that LA is dotted like a checkerboard of tribal lands and not tribal lands. Just tell her, like, Indians do exist and they're not scary and they won't, like, you know, scalp you. I don't know what are you talking about? But you know, like, this concept is really, like, I feel like sometimes we're kind of isolated into this like bubble that we're the only people in the world to ever experience this, and that's not true. Not at all, not even close. So anything that we can kind of like point to that like normalizes the very existence of a reservation would probably do a lot of good right now. And then once you do that kind of coverage, I think you're going to start looking at the perspective a little differently, because every problem that we're going to be ironing out for the first time ever for Oklahoma, it's already been done somewhere, somehow. Easements, FCC licenses, reservation jurisdiction, who owns what, it's been done. It's really been done. And then you can also start to look for trends, right? Look for trends. And then you have cutting edge coverage that nobody else has, right? Like, because we're documenting a snapshot in history, and kind of think of the stories and leads in that perspective too. And reach out of that bubble as much as we can. I think that's helpful.
Yeah, I think it would be good just to explore the historical and jurisdictional uniquity of this. As Angel mentioned, there's really no other reservation that came about like ours did, where it was reaffirmed way in the future after a big society had been built up within. And then maybe from there, go and compare that situation to other tribal jurisdictional situations around the country, because there are a lot of unique ones, and how, you know, ongoing issues those have created for those communities and how they've addressed them, and what laws may apply to both theirs and ours, and what insights that can give us.
And if you ever want to win over the hearts and minds of your Indigenous reader, do that story and pair it with like an avenue that says some of these places were tribal lands and those tribes don't exist anymore. And how fortunate are we to be Muscogee Creek people in a boundary that's reaffirmed and acknowledged by the federal government when history has erased so many of those peoples and their connections to the land. And I'm telling you that can go so far for the Indigenous reader, because that's all it's about for us. It's not really like, do we want to see only light horse administering justice? No, that isn't it. What we don't want to happen is to be those people long erased from existence because we've lost ties to our homelands. And that's something that I have not seen anyone ever touch.
And I'll say too, like circling back on familiarize yourself with the case. After that, start familiarizing yourself with our tribal government. Read our code, read our constitution, start trying to get folks at our legislative meetings and really understand what's happening there, because as you might be able to imagine, things are changing drastically and it's quite busy and hot down there as the tribe is trying to pivot and adapt to this case. And the new circumstance is creating some interesting dynamics within our government. So a lot of the coverage I see, it looks like folks are kind of doing by proxy, an external inquiry through the PR department about a piece that may have a broader impact. But, as things go on, a lot of what's going to be decided about how to handle this ruling is going to happen within the tribe's government. So not to encourage more competition for Angel, but, I think it will lead to better coverage in mainstream news if people start understanding the civics of the tribes, just like you did when you started covering the city beat in the state.
One of the things that I'm in a newsroom, and we've long history of fighting for the right to do the news unimpeded by government officials. One of the very unspoken, well-known rules, and I'm probably going to be shooting myself in the foot by sharing this, is everyone who's ever had a legacy through tribal media, they know two truths. They know you work as hard as you can to get the information and document your sources and get the documents. And they know that when you can't, you leak it to the mainstream media. Come ask me, email me, hit me up on DMs. I will get you there if I can, because the happiest day is I've been kicked out of council meetings for months and months, and they let Tulsa World in and they let Burt Mumbolo in. So now I get to go beat on their door and I get to say, what about me? Let me in. And I'm ready for it. We are always ready to facilitate those partnerships. And the great thing about it is we need very little credit or compensation to do it. We are just basically funded by the government and serving our citizens through information. So we're covered. We can be the best friend who helps you get invited to the party if you need to. As much as we can. There are going to be times when, you're going to run into brick walls, because we do. But I'm happy to share any of the contacts, trade secrets, whatever you need to get you where you need to go, for sure.
Well, I want to first appreciate that offer. I'll certainly take you up on it. And second, I think something, the civics of the tribe, I think is very important. We're going to work on a story where we're going to try to tell the origin story of the Muskogee people, because I think one of the things that people don't get is that this, I think Mike Sherman said it best, they don't know what this is. It doesn't matter how many times you write about it. They're not there. So what we're going to try to do is kind of do what we did with the race massacre, which is start at the beginning and tell a story from the beginning, and a narrative that lets you know where the Muskogee were, how they ended up here, who were at the table when that treaty was signed. We're going to go all the way back to the beginning. And, I'm trying not to make it a historical nonfiction narrative, but that's kind of what we're going to go after. And when the reporter was like, well, how much room are you going to give me? I go, well, how long is your history? She goes, well, it's pretty long.
Oh, yeah.
And she goes, there's a lot of conflict. And I said, well, I want the conflict. I want anything that's in a good story. But anyway, so we're going to try to go back to the beginning, because I can tell you the feedback we got on the race massacre coverage was, thank you for telling the story that was 3 stories ago. Because everyone starts with this story, but what about the 3 stories ago that started the roots, if you will.
That
So,
was phenomenal. I just got to say, your coverage of that, phenomenal.
thank you. Well, thank you very
That's-
much.
That's demonstrated success, that it is worthwhile to do that extra work, even though you've got so much on your plate coming down currently. It took extra time and resources for you to get that coverage done. Sometimes it takes a lot more time than a breaking story, but it paid off.
Well, I appreciate that very much. As I said, that was a team, all hands on deck, team-wide effort. And again, when we tell the first story, then we can tell the third story, which I think we're really, it sounds like this McGirt thing, we storyboarded it. It's kind of like the sixth story in the narrative.
Oh, for
We
sure.
almost got a Star Wars 6-episode thing going on. And we like came in on the third episode. Now we're on
Need
the
a crawl that goes up there.
Yeah, exactly. Well, but I'm saying when we
Put
storyboarded
together how George Lucas did it then.
exactly, I'm telling you, we're gonna go back. We jumped in on the third story. We're going to go back to the first story because what we found in some of the stuff, again, just going through our own archive when it comes to the Muscogee Nation, is that there are some stuff there that, oh, okay, that's so. Anyway, we're going to try to tell this origin story. And being a comic book geek, origin stories are always important because when you know the origin, then you know why they act the way they act. And so I think that there's some things there that we found in our own archive. We're also going to work with, try to go through some Tribune archives as well, which are a little sketchy. But
you start working on that origin story and you're going to understand so much better the like different dynamics when it comes to the freedmen, when it comes to intertribal relations, all of this will kind of like have an aha moment for you and it'll be like, wow, like that makes so much more sense right now. And I'm just an incredible huge fan of part of our job as the news is to understand like fatigue on a topic and how that's impacting our readers. And I think that these historical pieces can sometimes be that breath of fresh air we need when we've had too much doom and gloom. You know, when you start just hammering people with, well, here's another conviction that is now just an arrest, that gets really old really quick. And you start seeing people kind of just get really, but when you really try to dive into it and you demonstrate as an organization that you're trying to understand it all, and then you just give people some like random information that they just didn't have before, they're kind of like, oh, wow. I mean, that's why people like Paul Harvey's The Rest of the Story. It was always some kind of just history, interest, human interest kind of thing. And I mean, that's why like Flowers of the Killer Moon is blowing up right now because
that's the other one that we're doing. We're flipping over from one tragedy to another tragedy, and now going to write that story from our archives and from what we know. But I said, I think one of the things, and again, I'll definitely reach out for the help, is that if we tell this origin story from where you guys were and what you were in your culture then, and how the American government, because again, I have had so many people say, I had no idea, you know, and I didn't know that, and I didn't know this. And again, so again, we're going to dedicate the room to it. I think one of the things that, you know, I think we've done 40 double trucks since I've been editors in October. And we had 4 the previous 10 years. So making room for story is something we're going to keep doing at the Tulsa World. And as I said, this is one of the next ones we're going to do in a form where hopefully someone like yourself, Angel, and you guys will be able to understand that we'll try to go to the beginning here. Curtis will keep telling people when people get out. But if we start at the beginning here, hopefully by the end of this year, we'll have something that we can print that kind of starts at the very beginning. Because you go back to the civics comment, the civics are different. And the civics have to be understood because I think there's some narratives there, some stories there that would blow people's mind of what was the norm and what was taken away and what was off the table and what just didn't happen in some of these treaties. It's just ridiculous. So anyway, that's just a little of what we're going to try to do. Going to your point of why isn't someone writing about this? Why isn't someone write? That's where we're going to start there and then see what kind of branches out from there.
I think it's fabulous. I mean, I think that like your readers will discover facts like long before the United States of America ever existed, the Muskogee people had a tricameral government. Like things like that will blow their minds. They're like, wait, what? that was not brought over here from England. No, we were doing that thing, like we were doing it a different way, but and it usually involved a good game of stickball too. But hey, like those are interesting facts, and it's an interesting kind of evolution of where we are and understanding. Even at the time of these treaties and what it meant for allotment, to understand what a culture of people to own their own individual plots of land, how that land going into an individual's hands made that person vulnerable to instances like that played out with Killers of the Flower Moon. All of that starts to make so much more sense. And you see how it's pieced and parceled out, and that the Stigler Act put blood quantum contingencies on that. So as we've moved in to an area and other different ethnicities move into the area, we've intermarried, we've made bonds and friendships, and all of a sudden my blood quantum's too low to qualify for trust land, and you want me to start paying taxes on land I never paid taxes before, and so the government could take my land. The more you look at this stuff, the more you understand just how the entire paradigm shift of statehood looks so much different to Indigenous people. It really does. I have a person in my ancestry who was one of the richest Indians in America, deemed crazy and awarded the government because he owned land that was rich in oil. And I'm sitting here thinking, man, that would have been really handy going to college, like things like that. And it shifts an entire people's futures. At times, so that's just something important to kind of, I think, dig into. I think I applaud you for going that route.
Well, 1491, that Charles Mann book, is kind of a template that I have in my mind. That's the story of what America looked like before 1492. That book is, for me, kind of an idea of a place setter, if you will, like a time set, like context, and then it's like that everything, the last sentence is, and then this guy walked up on the beach. I mean, that's that idea that you tell that story before that, that 1491 is kind of what I've used to try to think of this as, let's paint the picture before that treaty was signed, and let's go backward from there. So anyway, that's just another thing that we're trying to grab a hold of.
Nice.
Great.
I expect I'll probably learn quite a bit from the final product myself.
I hope so. I hope so.
And, like Angel talked about mainstream media getting access when we didn't. Well, I know a lot of mainstream outlets have trouble getting hold of tribes, especially particular tribes. The only thing I can say is just keep trying. I mean, it is on them and their responsibility how much they want to control the conversation about the narrative and how this case affects them. But I can tell you, Creek Nation has a constructed PR department, speaking specifically about our tribe. And, like I said, I don't see it as acceptable where I see a piece where someone's done something in the DA or somebody has made an assertion where it's clear the tribe should have been contacted, and they don't even say that they tried to do it. And so I just want to, again, advocate for continuing to try and establish this rapport, with enough effort on both sides and having some discourse. Maybe we can get some good coverage out and elevate the public discourse on this.
Hey, Sterling, say you're a smaller outlet, or you maybe don't have the resources committed to Promised Land as much previously. How and where should you start? And should you reach out to the tribe? Should you talk to local law officials? Should you do listening tours? What do you recommend?
Well, it depends on what you're really trying to crack. If you're having trouble getting a hold of the tribe because it's something that it might be hard for them to respond to, you use your usual journalism tactics where, you can tell them, I've got the comment from the other side. I would really like to present you the opportunity to provide your case, and just go about it that way. That way they don't feel like you're attacking them, but rather trying to frame it as, I'm trying to give you a chance to speak your piece and make this fair. Going about it that way. And I think the process of how you, and the order of how you go about stories, can really help expedite getting a final product and getting interviews. And at NAJA too, we really encourage people not to do parachute journalism, but actually try and start building relationships with these tribes before you start asking for stuff from them.
That's a real cultural element for like Native people too. Like it's kind of just a thing. Like, like if you walk into the room and people are really quiet and they don't immediately greet you, you probably haven't spent enough time with them yet, because there really aren't quiet people. Like, once you get to know them, they're usually the type of people that come up and hug you and talk to you and everything like that. And then they recognize people, and it's just a kind of a I guess this just a cultural boundary to kind of like overcome. And some things, a lot of the time, that's a thing that you get the no comment or the no response, and I get it too. Even from the end, having some foot in the door already, I still get those all the time. And that's not necessarily an indictment on you to stop or to quit trying. It's more like they're probably trying to figure out what their message is going to be, because that's a thing. The tribe is thrust into, I know the Muscogee Nation went from being, like they're used to doing news and things like that. This is a whole nother level. Basically is where we're at now with the SCOTUS opinion. And so it's very intense. And with everything being like so closely watched, and so many of the communications being so important and sometimes used in court cases, it can be difficult. I would also say some of the tribes have FOIA processes, use them. Ours is a little bit more of an exclusive FOIA process, and I have not successfully gotten a FOIA through to the tribe, even with having a citizenship card. But if anybody wants, yeah, it's a brand new law. It just happened last summer, so we're going to test it as much as we can and see. And I would even, like, if anybody's wanting to do a story, I know people with citizenship cards that will put in your requests for you anytime you need them, because a lot of our citizens and all of us in our departments, too, many times they want information to reach the public. They want to get the right information out there. It's just that the processes are being built to facilitate that, to be honest.
Well, we're hitting about the hour mark. Angel, does anybody have any last comments, or hand it back to Rob?
Well, and you might keep in mind partnerships with FOIA requests on that subject too. I did put in some resources in the chat, including the editor of the Osage News, and we are doing the call outs for stakeholders based on that training from Joy Mayer with Trusting News. And NAJA is going to send out, along with some tribes, some of those reader forms for feedback. You should have links and embed codes in that resources doc, and I'll share with you here. This is the little tease we did on OMC's social media. This is a collective place for us to have this information. People can opt in for interviews. We really want to create a spreadsheet of responses and have that specific to search by zip code and relevance. So that would be a resource for you that we could share out. So I'd really encourage you to participate in that and use the Promised Land logo with all your coverage as well. Other than that, it's been a great session. Thank you, Sterling and Angel, for your thoughts. And anybody have any parting questions here as we wrap up?
Well, Rob, one thing that I was thinking about that would be a good idea is like when you go to the OklahomaMediaCenter.com and like our website, I feel like it'd be like a really great place, even center or towards the top, to put in some kind of a survey link or something so that people like are going there looking at our collaborative coverage, and if they have issues or problems or things that are coming up that we're not thinking, like Angel, you mentioned that with the ambulance, like those are all missed opportunities that we probably aren't hearing about in any other place. So I feel like having something like that front and center that you could kind of dump into a spreadsheet, like these are the issues that are coming in, so that we could all see and kind of start tackling it together.
I will pub
that
your
I had.
line if you have one.
What?
That's a good idea. Go ahead, Angel.
I will pub your tip line if you have one.
Good.
And it sounds like maybe OMC could use an audience facing frequently asked questions for all the members to use. That's something we can put together and share that out as well. Anybody have anything else?
Just want to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you, Rob, for setting us up.
Yes, we'll be doing some more things with NAJA this summer that we'll announce later. And this will be recorded. We will be able to share this out. So everybody have a great weekend, and thank you so much for attending.
Thank you, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.